Meet the most intense, hard-hitting safety of the 2000s. Nicknamed Weapon X, Brian Dawkins made a career out of tormenting opposing offenses, which eventually landed him a spot in the Hall of Fame. His iconic pregame ritual, where he would come out of the tunnel in a bear crawl, quickly made him an instant favorite to the Philly faithfuls. But how did he get there? Well, it all started back in 1987 when Brian first started to play the game of football. He didn't actually start playing football until his freshman year of high school. Dawkins stated, "To be honest with you, I really didn't like football. I was more of a basketball kid growing up, but when I first went out and tried it, I really enjoyed it. I was hooked." And from that point forward, Brian Dawkins' football story had begun. In his first year of high school, he played both running back and linebacker, completely dominating fellow JV kids. And it wasn't long until he caught the eyes of the varsity coach. In fact, it only took 4 games. And once Dawkins got called up to the varsity team, he requested to drop the running back position and focus on defense. Because he said, quote, "I'd rather be the one giving the lick than receiving it." He really started to come into his own once he started to solely focus on the defensive side of the ball, and eventually found his home after moving to the safety position. Dawkins wasn't a very highly recruited player in high school, but he did receive a couple of scholarships, one being from his hometown dream school of Florida, and the other being from South Carolina. Dawkins made it a foregone conclusion that he was going to be a Florida Gator next year, but there was only one problem with that. His GPA didn't end up being high enough, and the Gators eventually withdrew the scholarship. And Dawkins, who was devastated, decided to get his act together and work hard to raise his GPA, and eventually settled for the other team that offered him a scholarship, South Carolina. So he reached out, and no answer. So Dawkins, who seemingly had nowhere to continue his playing career, got in contact with fellow friend and classmate Patrick Sapp, a highly touted quarterback recruit who had offers all throughout his home state of Florida as well as Clemson. He and Dawkins spoke on the phone about how it would be cool playing together, so Sapp asked Dawkins if he'd like to come play with him in Clemson. Dawkins obviously agreed, but what he didn't know is that Sapp had talked to the Clemson coach at the time, Ken Hatfield, and basically said, "If you want me to play for you at Clemson, you have to bring along my friend Brian as well." Hatfield agreed, and the two were off to Clemson. Upon arriving at Clemson, Dawkins immediately started playing like he had a chip on his shoulder, and for being an undersized safety, you sure couldn't tell. Dawkins' aggressive playstyle and hard-hitting ability quickly caught the eye of head coach Ken Hatfield. His freshman year at Clemson, Dawkins racked up 3 interceptions en route to what turned out to be a very solid first year at Clemson. At the end of his sophomore season, where he had 82 tackles and 2 interceptions, being able to play in the NFL began to become a real possibility for Dawkins. And in his final season as a Tiger, he put up 89 tackles and a team-high 6 interceptions, and later was drafted in the 2nd round by the Philadelphia Eagles. In Brian Dawkins' rookie season with the Eagles, he finished with 75 combined tackles, 3 interceptions, and a touchdown. The Eagles, however, finished with a 9-6 record and unfortunately missed the playoffs. The defense finished 24th overall, but allowed the 7th fewest passing yards with 2,923 yards behind Brian Dawkins in the Eagles secondary. After Dawkins' first season as an Eagle, tragedy struck. Suffering from the immense pressure of being a newlywed, to a father, to a professional football player, to being the breadwinner of a family, came with his challenges. Dawkins said, quote, "I didn't know how to deal with my emotions. And all the pressure started to amount, and so anger quickly turned to rage, which turned to depression, which turned to drinking." Fortunately, Dawkins turned to his wife Connie and teammate Emmett Thomas for help, and later found God, and promised to never let another sip of alcohol touch his lips ever again. And once his second season came around, Dawkins fixed his demons and was back focused on the thing he loved: football. Dawkins didn't quite have as good of a season as his rookie campaign, only tallying 55 combined tackles, 2 interceptions, and a sack. And following the season, the Eagles elected to fire head coach Ray Rhodes after an abysmal 3-13 record, electing to hire new head coach Andy Reid. In Dawkins' 3rd year and first under head coach Andy Reid, he had a breakout year where he had 73 tackles, 6 forced fumbles, 4 interceptions, 1.5 sacks, and a touchdown, which was good enough to be named to his first Pro Bowl, which little did Dawkins know would end up being his first of many. The league started to take notice of Dawkins' big hits, and he was quickly becoming known as the guy to watch out for if you didn't want to have to make a trip to the hospital after the game. However, his efforts weren't enough to get Philly to the playoffs, and they finished another disappointing season at 5-11. However, things were about to change in the 2000 season. Things got off to a mild start when they went 1-2 in the first 3 weeks. Dawkins was then injured and forced to miss 3 games due to a foot injury, but came back in week 7 against the Cardinals to help Philly get the win and improve to 4-3. The Eagles later finished the season at 11-5, and Dawkins put up 72 tackles and 4 interceptions to end the season, and Philly was off to the playoffs for the first time in Brian Dawkins' young career. They played the Buccaneers in the wildcard round, which they beat 21-3 behind Donovan McNabb's 2-touchdown game and Brian Dawkins' somewhat quiet 2-tackle performance. Unfortunately for the Eagles, they ran into a division rival, the New York Giants, in the divisional round of the playoffs, and couldn't quite get the job done, losing 20-10. The Giants would later go on to get blown out by the Ravens in the Super Bowl that year. 2001 was more of the same in Philly, where they finished with another 11-5 record behind Dawkins' 70 tackles, 2 interceptions, and 2 forced fumbles. And the Eagles secondary allowed the second fewest passing yards that season, which led to Dawkins being named to a second Pro Bowl in his young NFL career. And just like last year, the Eagles squared off against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the wildcard round and beat them 31-9 with the help of Brian Dawkins' 2 tackles, 2 pass deflections, and interception. Philly and company quickly turned their attention to Chicago, where they also won, beating them 33-19. And now Brian Dawkins found himself just 1 win away from making it to the biggest game of his life. But unfortunately, he and the Eagles fell short once more, losing to the Rams 29-24 in the NFC Championship game. The following season, the Eagles found themselves as one of the favorites to come out of the NFC, and a big reason for that, they had who many considered the most intimidating free safety in the NFL. They finished that season 12-4 and once again found themselves in the NFC Championship game once again. This time facing the Buccaneers, who they had beaten the last 2 years in the wild card round. However, history did not repeat itself and the Eagles were once again eliminated from the playoffs. The 2002 offseason was an important one for Brian Dawkins and his future. His contract was up in Philly and Dawkins questioned whether or not he could ever win a championship there in Philly. There were many teams who would have loved Brian Dawkins' services at free safety, but he eventually decided to ride it out with the Philly Faithfuls and try to bring home a Lombardi trophy to the city of brotherly love. He signed a 6-year, $43 million contract to stay in Philly for the foreseeable future. The 2003 season looked like much of the same. Dawkins played like one of the best safeties in the league, and the Eagles had one of the better regular season records in the NFL. But they just couldn't get the job done, losing once again in the conference championship game to the Panthers. The 2004 season looked to be different. The Eagles got off to a very hot start with a 13-1 record throughout the first 14 games. They would finish the season at 13-3, and Dawkins would have yet another Pro Bowl season, having 70 tackles, 3 sacks, and 4 interceptions. Dawkins and the Eagles looked to be unstoppable this season, cruising past the competition in the NFC and making it to the Super Bowl for the first time in Brian's career. The season, however, would end in heartbreak, losing to the Patriots 21-24 in the Super Bowl. The Eagles, like many other teams that make it to the Super Bowl, would experience the Super Bowl hangover in 2005, failing to even make the playoffs, the first time that had happened in 5 years. Dawkins, however, put up another Pro Bowl season with 80 tackles, 3.5 sacks, and 3 interceptions. The following 3 years, Dawkins continued to play great for Philly, making it to 2 Pro Bowls out of the 3 years, but the Eagles just couldn't seem to be able to recreate that same magic they did in 2004. And at the end of the 2008 season, Dawkins found himself in the same situation he found himself in 6 years ago. His contract was up, he was now 36 years old, and Philly just couldn't seem to get over that hump. And this time, Dawkins decided to change the scenery and take his talents to the Mile High City in Denver. There was no denying that Dawkins was coming to the end of his career and wasn't quite the same player he once was. Dawkins would play the next 3 seasons in Denver, and in his first 2 seasons with his new team, they failed to even make the playoffs. But in Dawkins' last season before retirement, he helped lead the Broncos to an 8-8 record and just squeezing them into the playoffs. This was his last chance to finally win the big one. And in the wildcard round, they managed to upset the 12-4 Steelers in overtime and move on to the divisional round. Dawkins and company were trying to continue their Cinderella story against the Patriots, who were beginning to become a dynasty at this point. And the Broncos got blown out 45-19, and that ended the Hall of Fame career of Brian Dawkins. He finished his 16-year career with 1,147 tackles, 26 sacks, 36 forced fumbles, 37 interceptions, and was named to 9 Pro Bowls. A Hall of Fame career worth celebrating.